Glad to have you in the audience this morning. Those who are joining us electronically, we're certainly glad to have you. The lesson this morning is in the second chapter of Lamentations, beginning with the 16th verse. Lamentations 2, verse 16. Lamentations is just that. Lamentations. The second chapter of Lamentations has to do with essentially the suffering of the sanctuary. Has to do with the temple situation. The temple was central to Jerusalem. It was central to the Israelis. It was central to their worship, central to their civil government. It was just a central figure. And of course, the Babylonians destroyed it, and that was a great lament to the conscientious Jews. Now, in the middle of this chapter, we find that the enemies, sometimes allies of the Jews, were really glad to see the fall of Jerusalem. They were glad to see the temple destruction. And so that's where we are today in the 16th verse of the second chapter of Lamentations. Verse 16 reads, "And thine enemies have opened their mouth against thee. They hiss and gnash the teeth. They say, we have swallowed her up." Notice they say, we have swallowed her up. Of course, the Babylonians were the main swallowers. We have swallowed her up. Certainly this is the day that we have looked for. They were longing for the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, everything Jewish. We have swallowed her up. Certainly this is the day that we look for, that we longed for, that we waited for. We have found, we have seen it, and now it's come to pass. It's a great day that Jerusalem was destroyed in the minds of the enemies. Now, the Lord, in verse 17, hath done that which he has devised. Now, that idea of devised, it has his purposed. Back in the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy, Jews were warned that if they did not follow the law of Moses, if they participated in evil, there would be destruction. And finally, God gave up on them in terms of them, and they weren't penitent, and so God allowed their destruction. The Lord hath done that which he hath devised, which is purposed, which he said he would do. He hath fulfilled his word, that he hath commanded the ways of old. Commanded the ways of old. This wasn't new information. This idea that, evil brings on destruction. This was not new. It was in the law of Moses. It's part of the law of Moses. It's part of what they should have known. And I suppose many of them did know, but they didn't care. He hath thrown down, and hath not pitied. God, since it was his purpose, since he was sovereign, since he had the right, he destroyed, and he didn't pity. Now think about this. What happened to Sodom and Gomorrah? And yet the Jews were as bad as those of Sodom and Gomorrah. Nonetheless, he didn't pity the destruction in his sovereignty. He hath not pitied. He hath caused thine enemy to rejoice over thee. The enemies thought they were doing it on their own, but God kind of gave them kind of incentive or In some, did someone have a comment? Or did that come through okay. And he hath not pitied, he hath caused thine enemy to rejoice over thee. He hath set up the horn of thine adversary. What's horn mean there? It means power. It means a horn on an animal is a symbol of power. Verse 18, their heart cried unto the Lord. Now in verse 18, beginning there for a few verses, we have this idea of they're really wailing. They're really in a world of hurt. And they're crying out. Their heart crieth unto the Lord, O wall of the daughter of Zion. Let the tears run down like a river day. Now, the description of the destruction was that the walls of Jerusalem were crying out. Tears run down like a river, day and night. Give thyself no rest. Let not the apple of thine eye cease. That idea of the apple of thine eye cease, that is, the eyes were in respite. The eyes were, continually red, tearing up. Said, that's the way it is. That's the way it's going to be. Verse 19, arise and cry out in the night. In the beginning of the watches, the Jews had a certain hours of the night where they had watches. I guess they changed, guards, and we even see that obviously in the New Testament, in the Jewish culture. And he's saying there, arise and cry out in the nights, in the beginning of the watches. Pour out thine heart like water before the face of the Lord. Lift up thine hands toward him for the life of thy young children that faint for hunger in the top of every street. Now, what happens when the social order gets bad? What happens when the social order is in totally evil and there's destruction all around? Do only the guilty get hurt? Yeah. In communities where there's bloodshed every night, do only those who are guilty of crime get hurt? No. We see that every day. If you listen to the radio or the TV, if you read the Dispatch or any other news, you know that innocents are affected by the crime, the debauchery of the social order within any community, any country. So here, lift up thine hands toward him for the life of thy children that faint for hunger in the top of every street. Everybody is suffering here. The innocent, the guilty, the rich, the poor, everybody. Behold, in verse 20, behold, O Lord, and consider. Now, here we're going to talk about praying here. Behold, O Lord, and consider whom thou hast done this. To whom thou hast done this. Now, here's kind of the prayer to God. Things were so bad. He says, behold, O Lord, consider to whom thou hast done this. Consider who's being hurt. And to man's mind, the innocent shouldn't suffer, right? And so that's his appeal. He's saying, to whom thou hast done this. Consider that. God could take into consideration the situation here. Shall the women eat their fruit, eat their children? So hungry that they would stoop to that level of debauchery? And the children of span long being, something like 7 to 9 inches or something like that. Children, he's talking about infants here. Shall the priest and the prophet be slain in the sanctuary of the Lord? In this most holy place. Apparently the priests and the workers in the temple were slain there in that sacred environment. And he's appealing to God. Is this what you wanted to do? Is this what you wanted to happen or allow to happen? Shall the priest and the prophet be slain in the sanctuary of the Lord, in the very temple, in the very seat of religious government and seat of religious practice? The young and the old lie on the ground in the streets. God, don't you see this? That the appeal there seems to be, God, don't you see this? That the young men are fallen by the sword. Verse 21, thou hast slain them by the sword, and hast slain them in the day of thine anger. Thou hast killed and not pitied. Thou hast killed and not pitied. Thou hast called us in a solemn day, my terrors, round about, so that in this day of the Lord's anger none escaped, none remained. Those that I have swaddled and brought up hath mine enemy consumed. Complete destruction. Everybody's affected. Guilty, innocent, everybody's affected here. Now, I suppose Jeremiah, or don't you suppose, that Jeremiah was wondering, how does God allowing all this destruction to take place, not pitying, not being, and seemingly compassionate, how does that comport with the goodness of God? How do you reconcile? I think he's saying, God, how do you reconcile your goodness with the destruction of Jerusalem, your footstool? How do you reconcile that? Well, Ned, how do you reconcile that? Preacher, how do you reconcile that? God is sovereign. God is the creator. God is the creator and sustainer of the universe. God sets up the rules. And all this was the consequence of disobeying the rules. Does that make any sense? Yeah. Yeah. So but would that be hard to understand? Well, you're the one going through it, yeah. It would be. You would, at the time, you would be saying, well, wait a minute, this doesn't seem quite right. And that's what Jeremiah is saying here. He's saying, I know, intellectually I know what the law says, I know what happened, but then, when I'm going through it, or if I'm going through it, I'm thinking, really? Is this the way it's supposed to be? Is God really that good? I mean, intellectually, what you said makes sense. But if you're in the throes of all this, you know, it may... have you ever heard somebody say, why has God let this happen to me? You ever heard that? Well, what have I done that I'm being treated this way? Or that sort of thing. Well, that's what Jeremiah, as great as he was, had some of those, you know, he was kind of approaching God with, what's going on here? You know, this doesn't seem quite. To my intellect, it just doesn't seem that to right. And then in the 3rd chapter, which is the longest chapter in this Lamentations, you remember each chapter had 22 verses, each verse starting with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and then except one, and it's kind of mixed up. And then this is 22 verses in this chapter, or I'm sorry, 66 verses in this chapter. They're 3 times as long, 66 verse. So in chapter 3, Jeremiah sinks into sorrows. Not a good day, you know, not very, very few good days, or maybe no good days, none whatsoever. Jeremiah sorrows. That's what we read about here, and we could identify with Jeremiah, I think, here. He says, I'm the man that has seen affliction. Had Jeremiah seen affliction before the destruction of Jerusalem? He was jailed. He's beaten by his countrymen. He was ignored. He went through trauma continually. But now that the destruction, the ultimate destruction here, you know, I guess he didn't sit around and say, well, you know, I told you so. I told you what was going to happen. No, he didn't want to see the destruction of Jerusalem, of course. He says, I am the man that has seen affliction. I've seen this instruction by the rod of his wrath, as a result of God's wrath against the evil of Jerusalem and Judea and the Jews generally that were not in obedience with the law of Moses. He hath led me and brought me into darkness, but not into light. He was in a dark mood. I mean, emotionally, intellectually, in every way, he was in darkness. Verse 3, surely against me is he turned. Jeremiah took this personally. This destruction, he took it personally. He's saying, surely against me. Here he's expressing his sorrow. Certainly is against me he has turned. He has turned his hand against me all day. Now he's internalizing, he's personalizing all this destruction and grief. Surely against me as he turned his hand against me all the day, continually, all day long, all night long. And how has this affected him? Well, he says, my flesh, my skin hath he made old. Reminds us of the situation with Job when he was in his world of hurt. He says, my flesh and my skin hath he made old. wrinkled. It was, lack of nutrition, the result of harassment, the result of sorrow. Can people hide their sorrow? Sometimes. Usually not. But he was in a sorrowful situation. He hath broken my bones. Probably not, maybe some bones broken-eyed, but it's probably, that's just an expression. He's just broken me down. He hath builded against me and compassed me with gall. Now that gall stuff was some bitter, anything that was totally bitter, bitter to the taste, bitter to the skin. And he hath builded against me and compassed me. That is, he surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. That gall is bitterness, and travail or hard. Travail has to do with hardship. He's just repeating. He was just just expressing his grief and sorrow. Verse 5, verse 6, he has set me in dark places, and as they that be dead of old. Now that's a pitiful, emotional situation there. He was as if dead. He hath hedged me, that is, he has surrounded me, hedged me about, that I cannot get out. He hath made my chain heavy. Now, Jeremiah had been in chains before, had he not? During his ministry. But had he gotten out of some of that? Had he gotten out of... Think back when, as we've studied Jeremiah, think back that he'd been thrown in the pit, but he'd been rescued, right? He'd been thrown in jail, but then released. He'd been beaten, but yet relieved of it. But now what's happened? He's probably thinking about, I've been in kind of this situation before, but there's I found, I got out of it. Now he's saying he's hedged me about that I cannot get out. He's put me in chains, and it's over. I'm stuck here. So he was certainly crying out to God. He might have been thinking, well, God, you've rescued me before. But it seems like I'm just being trapped. Can't get out. That would be an awful feeling, of course, and that's his expression as to the way he actually felt. Verse 8, also when I cry and shout, he shutteth out my prayer. He's saying, I'm praying, but God is not listening. He shutteth out God. He's saying, God, you're not listening. He hath enclosed my ways with hewn stone. He hath made my paths crooked. Now, you can imagine what he's saying here. He's saying, you put rocks in my path. That's not a good thing. We don't like potholes, right? We don't like stony ground, so to speak. He's saying here that, God, you put rocks in my path. Not only that, but you've made the road crooked. That's wine. It's crooked. It's not a good path. He's laying out his frustrations. He hath, in verse 10, he was unto me as a bear lying in wait. and as a lion in secret places. So let's suppose you were in a situation where there were lions, there were ferocious animals, and you just didn't know if you go around the corner or you go, down the path. You don't know what's waiting for you, and I suppose he's saying, I'm waiting for the next shoe to fall. I'm waiting for, I'm wondering what else is going to happen to me. He hath turned aside my ways. He's pulled me in pieces. He hath made me desolate. Wow. He's made me ruined. He hath bent his bow and set a mark as a mark for the arrow. What's he talking about there? He's made me target practice. It's as if he's saying, I'm being what do you call those things when they would shoot an arrow at something? What, a target? Yeah. I'm a. Pardon me? Yeah, bullseye. Yeah. God, you're using me as a target, and not only that, but the arrows are penetrating. They're penetrating. He's saying he bent his bow, set me the mark, a target for the arrow, and he has caused the arrows of his quiver to enter into my reins. That would be his heart, his internal organs, his body organs. He says it's really affected me totally. I was a derision to all my people. Now, he may be hearkening back to some of his experience as a minister, as God's minister, as God's prophet. He says, I was as a derision. Now, what's that idea of derision? Pardon me? Ridicule. He's making me a target. The people are making fun of me. They're ridiculing me. A derision. I was a derision to all my people. And their song all day long. We don't know when this took place. It might have been prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. It may have even been after the destruction that he was the subject of them making up little ditties and songs. And Jeremiah, what happened to Jeremiah after the destruction of Jerusalem? There were a few people left, and they set up some leadership there for the few people who were left. What did they force Jeremiah? What did the leadership of that group force Jeremiah to do? Accompany them to Egypt. Did he want to go to Egypt? Probably not. But they, so here's a prophet who was ridiculed, was maligned, was imprisoned for his preaching, and then after the destruction of Jerusalem, he was still a target. And Jeremiah is saying, God, why all of this? I was a derision to all my people, and their song all the day. He hath filled me with bitterness. Wonder what that means. Bitterness. Filled me with bitterness. I mean, they filled him with, saying he ingested something.
Back in Jeremiah 20, verse 7, he says, O Lord, you induced me, and I was persuaded. You are stronger than I, and I have prevailed. I am in derision daily, everyone mocks me. So, even in Jeremiah, they were mocking.
Yeah, so during his ministry, or the prophesying. Yeah. He hath made me drunken with wormwood. He hath he's just in a state of not being able, I suppose, be in full control of himself. And maybe his crying out here was an indication that he wasn't in full control of himself. Now he has broken my teeth with gravel stones. He hath covered me with ashes. Now Jeremiah's covering it all, isn't he? It's as if, instead of eating food, he's being fed stones, which has caused him to have his teeth, broken. He's covered me with ashes. That was something that the Jews did, and the people of that era did when they were in great sorrow. They'd sit on the ground and cover themselves with dust and ashes, clothed in sackcloth or rough clothing. Broken my teeth with gravel stones. He hath covered me with ashes. And thou hast removed my soul from afar off, from peace. I forgot prosperity. He was probably at the lowest ebb of life, totally decimated, physically, probably spiritually, emotionally, in every other way. And then he kind of gets a grip. He reviewed this all in his mind, and now he comes to his senses, so to speak. He gets a grip, and he says, "And I said, my strength and my hope is perished from the Lord. Remembering mine affliction and my misery, the wormwood and the gall, my soul hath them still in remembrance, as humbled in me." And then he says, "This I recall to my mind. Therefore I have hope." Now, without reading any further, what do you suppose he was thinking now? After he had reviewed after he had uttered all of these things in the presence of God, then what does he say? He, in a sense, comes to his senses. He says, "This I recall to my mind. Therefore I have hope." Why did he have hope in the midst of all this misery? What's he going to say next? He says, "It is of the Lord's mercy, that we've not been consumed." I suppose he might have even been thinking of Sodom and Gomorrah and those civilizations in the past that God had just wiped from the face of the earth. And he's saying, it is of the Lord's mercies that we've not been consumed. So there's I don't know whether you want to talk about a silver lining in the cloud or talk about, that sliver of hope. But he says, it is of the Lord's mercies that we have not been consumed, because his compassions faileth not. His purposes, God's purposes, are not going to be thwarted by what's happening here. And as was said a while ago, that God's purposes are pure and his purposes are for the good. Verse 23, they are new every morning. Now, what's that song that sometimes is sung at camp and other times? It's taken from these verses. They are new every morning. What's new every morning? His mercies, his compassions, they are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. How could he say that in the condition he was in? Well, he started thinking straight here, understanding God's sovereignty and his goodness. And he says, the Lord is my portion, saith my soul. I fit into God's scheme of things. The Lord is my portion, saith my soul, therefore will I hope in him. The Lord is good. Now, see, he comes, he's thinking what maybe he should have been thinking all along. He said, the Lord is good unto them that wait for him, the soul that seeketh him. Now, this idea of waiting on the Lord, what's that all about? If you want to talk through your mask, you can. What's the idea there? That idea of waiting.
Basically accept God's timing and his will.
Ned says accepting God's timing. That's a good way of thinking about this. His timing relates to his purpose, and as his plan plays out, sometimes man has to wait on it. How long did mankind wait after this for the Savior to come? 4 to 5 centuries, right? Don't you suppose there were some conscientious Jews that were, wanting this to happen? Those that understood the prophecies, not necessarily the timing of the prophecies, but don't you suppose that some of them were wondering, well, when's this going to happen? But it happened in God's time schedule and not man's time schedule, you see. And of course that has implications for daily living as well. The Lord is good. That has to be understood, and that is paramount to understand. That in the midst of misery and whatever, one has to remember that God is good and is going to, and it might not be on our schedule, and we might not understand it, but we have to understand that the Lord is good unto them that wait for him, to the soul that seeketh him. Verse 26, it is good that a man should both hope and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. And it might not take place in one's lifetime. What man prays for might not take place until generations pass. Verse 27 is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. He sitteth alone and keepeth silence, because he hath borne it upon him. He putteth his mouth in the dust. If so be, there may be hope. In spite of everything that's going on, there is hope, he's saying. He giveth his cheek to him that smiteth him. He is filled full with reproach. He is filled full with reproach. For the Lord will not cast off forever. Jeremiah is beginning to understand now that this is as bad as it is. It's temporary. But though he cause grief, yet will he have compassion, according to the multitude of his mercies. So, Jeremiah is understanding now. He's articulating what he already knew while he was talking about, God, why is all this happening? And he's now he's now articulating in this narration the other side of the question. For the Lord will not cast off forever, but though he cause grief, yet he will have compassion, according to the multitudes of his mercies. In verse 23 above, he's repeating that idea. For he doth not afflict willingly. Now here, isn't this interesting? For he doth not afflict willingly. Was God happy that he had to punish the Jews? You suppose God was saying, well, I told them and now I'm going to get them. He was not happy that he had to administer the punishment. For he doth not afflict willingly, nor grieve the children of men, to crush under his feet all the prisoners of the earth. God doesn't take delight in having to punish. He has, because of his nature, because of his purpose, punishment is part of the deal. But that doesn't mean that God is, happy about it. To crush under feet all the prisoners of the earth. To turn aside the right of a man before the face of the Most High. To subvert a man in his cause, the Lord approveth not. God's not happy with having to administer this punishment. We'll stop there in verse 36.